Nobody believed the number when it first came through. That was the part the historians always got wrong later, smoothing it into a clean narrative where everyone immediately understood the scale of what was coming. The truth was messier. When the Deep Space Tracking Array at Europa Station first reported 10,412 individual contact signatures moving in formation through the outer system, the first response from 3 separate analysts was not alarm. It was the quiet, professional assumption that the sensors had simply broken. Director Alina Marsh was 40 minutes into reviewing the same data when she finally accepted that the sensors were working perfectly fine, and that the number was real, and that the number was the actual problem. "Run it again," she said anyway, because some numbers deserve to be wrong twice before you let yourself believe them. "I've run it 6 times, Director," said her senior analyst, a quiet man named Felix Doyle who had spent 11 years calibrating exactly this kind of system and had never once needed to question its output before today. 10,412. The formation is too dense and too uniform to be anything but a coordinated war fleet. Nothing natural moves like that. Elena stared at the tactical display, at the impossible bloom of contacts spreading across the outer system like a slow-motion detonation, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear yet, because fear required time to arrive properly. And right now, there was only the cold, clarifying recognition that everything about humanity's defense planning had just become irrelevant in a single sensor sweep. Every contingency anyone had ever built, every simulation, every doctrine document gathering dust in a server somewhere, had been designed around scenarios involving dozens of hostile ships, perhaps low hundreds in the worst theoretical cases anyone had taken seriously. Nobody, in any serious planning session across 40 years of preparing for first contact, had ever modeled an attacking force of 10,000 vessels, because 10,000 vessels was not a number that any single civilization should have been able to produce, let alone deploy across interstellar distance in a single coordinated strike. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," Elena said, "and get me General Castellan not in an hour now." What the Alien Armada, designated, in the frantic early hours, simply as the Threll Compact based on intercepted command chatter, had not accounted for was a peculiarity of human strategic thinking that no amount of long-range observation could have revealed to them. Humanity's defense planners had spent decades assuming that any future war, when it came, would arrive in a form too large and too overwhelming for any conventional military response to matter. They had not built their doctrine around matching enemy numbers, because matching numbers against 10,000 ships was never going to be possible for a single planet with a population still measured in mere billions, rather than the kind of multi-system industrial base that could produce a fleet that size. Instead, decades of quiet, unglamorous theoretical work had gone into a different question entirely. What do you do when you cannot possibly win a fight on the terms it's being offered to you? General Tomas Castellan, no relation, despite the surname, to the Maria Castellan who had become a household name after the Kavaram incident years earlier, a coincidence that generated considerable confusion in early news coverage, until the 2 officers issued a joint statement clarifying they had never even met, received Elena's call while reviewing maps in his office at the Joint Defense Coordination Headquarters. He listened to the number twice before responding. "Say that again," he said. 10,412 individual contacts, General, confirmed across 3 independent sensor arrays. This isn't a sensor error. This is real. Tomas set down his coffee, a gesture that would later become something of a recurring motif in how this particular crisis was retold, since it seemed that every senior officer involved in receiving the initial alert had, at some point, set down an inconvenient cup of coffee they would never finish. "Pull every available defense asset onto a secure briefing in 20 minutes, he said. "And Alina, I need you to understand something before this call ends. We do not have a plan for 10,000 ships. We have never had a plan for 10,000 ships. What we have is a plan for what to do when the numbers stop mattering, and I need everyone in that briefing room to understand the difference before we proceed, because if we walk in there trying to fight this conventionally, we lose before the first shot is fired." The briefing that followed, held in the underground command facility outside Colorado Springs that had become something of an unofficial nerve center for Earth's defense apparatus over the preceding decade, brought together a collection of officers, analysts, and engineers who had spent their careers preparing for threats that, until this morning, had remained purely theoretical. Among them was Colonel Naomi Whitfield, head of Earth's Deep Space Tactical Doctrine Division, whose entire professional reputation had been built on a controversial theory. She had spent 15 years defending against skeptics who considered it borderline irresponsible. "This is it," Whitfield said, the moment Tomas finished outlining the scale of the incoming fleet. "This is the scenario. Everyone in this room who ever told me the severance doctrine was an overreaction owes me an apology, but we can have that conversation after we survive the week." The severance doctrine, as Whitfield had originally proposed it nearly 2 decades earlier in a paper that had been quietly shelved, and then quietly revived multiple times depending on the political climate of any given year, rested on a single uncomfortable premise: that any sufficiently large attacking force, however numerically overwhelming, remained fundamentally dependent on a small number of critical coordination points to function as a coherent fleet rather than 10,000 individually meaningless vessels. Remove or disrupt those coordination points, the theory argued, and a fleet of any size could be reduced, almost instantly, to a disorganized scattering of ships incapable of executing complex tactics, vulnerable not to brute force resistance, but to the simple chaos of 10,000 independent commanders suddenly receiving no unified instruction at all. "Walk us through it," Tomas said. "Assume everyone in this room has read the paper but hasn't thought about it in 5 years, because most of us haven't." Whitfield pulled up a tactical model on the briefing room's main display, the 10,000 contacts rendered as a dense, shifting cloud of red icons. "A fleet this size cannot function through 10,000 individual decision-makers acting independently. It's not possible. The communication overhead alone would collapse any attempt at coordinated maneuver within minutes, which means somewhere in that formation there is a command structure, probably layered, probably redundant, but ultimately finite. Identify the actual coordination nodes, the ships actually issuing tactical instructions rather than simply receiving them, and you don't need to defeat 10,000 ships. You need to defeat a few dozen, and let the resulting confusion do the rest of the work for you." "And if we're wrong about which ships those are?" asked Rear Admiral Priya Banerjee, commander of Earth's orbital defense fleet, her tone carrying the particular skepticism of someone whose own ships would be the first committed to testing the theory. "Then we've committed our entire available fleet against a numerically catastrophic enemy based on an unproven 15-year-old paper, and we lose everything," Whitfield said, without flinching. "I'm not going to pretend there's no risk here, but Admiral, look at the alternative. We have at absolute maximum readiness perhaps 230 combat-capable vessels across every available defense platform on and around Earth. Even with every advantage in the universe, 230 ships do not defeat 10,000 through direct engagement. That math doesn't exist. It has never existed. Our only path to surviving this is making the 10,000 stop functioning as 10,000. Banerjee was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical display before she finally nodded slowly. "Then we'd better be right about which ships to hit." This, in essence, became the entirety of humanity's plan in the 17 hours available before the Threll Compact fleet would reach effective engagement range of Earth's orbital defenses. Not a strategy for fighting 10,000 ships, because no such strategy existed or could exist, but a single narrow, high-risk wager that identifying and eliminating a small number of critical command vessels could collapse the coherence of an otherwise overwhelming force before it ever needed to be fought in the conventional sense at all. Identifying those command vessels in the hours that followed became the responsibility of a team led by Felix Doyle, the same analyst whose careful sensor recalibration had first confirmed the impossible scale of the incoming fleet. Working with a combination of passive sensor data, decades of accumulated signals intelligence on alien communication patterns gathered from prior limited encounters with other species, and a considerable amount of educated guesswork under brutal time pressure. Doyle's team began the painstaking process of mapping the internal structure of a fleet that outnumbered Earth's entire defense capacity by a factor of more than 40 to 1. There, Doyle said, 11 hours into the analysis, pointing to a cluster of 7 vessels positioned roughly in the geometric center of the larger formation. These 7 ships are transmitting on a frequency band distinct from everything else in the fleet, in bursts that correlate almost exactly with formation-wide course corrections. If Whitfield's theory holds, these are the coordination nodes. Only 7? Tomas asked, studying the data himself. Out of 10,000 ships, the entire fleet's coherence depends on 7 vessels. Possibly fewer, Doyle said. We've identified 7 that we're confident about. There may be additional redundant nodes we haven't located yet, secondary command vessels designed to take over if the primary nodes are lost. But based on everything we're seeing, these 7 are carrying the load right now. Take them out simultaneously before any redundancy can activate, and you create a window. We don't know how long, could be minutes, could be longer, where the rest of the fleet has no unified tactical direction at all. This was, by any reasonable military standard, an extraordinarily thin foundation on which to commit Earth's entire available defense fleet. 7 ships, identified through educated inference rather than confirmed intelligence, out of a hostile force of more than 10,000 vessels. If the analysis was wrong, if those 7 ships were simply administrative vessels with no particular tactical significance, humanity would have thrown its entire defense capability at an irrelevant target, while the actual coordinated fleet continued its advance unimpeded. I need a second opinion, Tomas said, not because he distrusted Doyle's analysis specifically, but because the stakes demanded it. Get me Whitfield and Banerjee both, and anyone else with relevant signals intelligence experience. I want this checked 6 more times before I commit a single ship. The verification process consumed nearly 4 of the 17 hours available, time that everyone in the command facility understood was being spent at considerable risk, since every hour spent confirming the target was an hour closer to the fleet entering engagement reign, regardless of whether humanity was ready. But Tomas held firm on the verification, a decision that would later be cited extensively in military academies as an example of disciplined decision-making under extreme time pressure. The willingness to spend scarce time confirming a critical assumption, even when every instinct screamed to act immediately, because acting immediately on a wrong assumption would have been catastrophically worse than acting 4 hours later on a confirmed one. By the time the analysis was as confirmed as it could possibly be given the circumstances, Admiral Banerjee had assembled her strike force, 60 of Earth's fastest, most heavily armed interceptor vessels, selected specifically for a mission that prioritized speed and precision over the kind of sustained engagement capability that would have been useless against a fleet this size anyway. This is everything, Banerjee told her assembled pilots, in a briefing that several of them later described as the shortest and most unsettling pre-mission address any of them had ever received. 60 ships against 10,000. I am not going to stand here and tell you this is a fair fight because it isn't, and I am not going to pretend the odds favor us because they don't. What I will tell you is this: we are not trying to fight 10,000 ships today. We are trying to make 7 specific ships stop functioning before the other 9,993 notice we've done it. If we succeed, the rest of this war becomes something very different than what it currently looks like. If we fail, it becomes exactly as bad as the numbers suggest it should be. Captain Sarah Lindqvist, leading the lead interceptor squadron in the strike force, asked the question that several other pilots in the room had clearly been thinking but hadn't voiced. Admiral, what happens to us if the strike succeeds but we can't get out before the rest of the fleet reacts? Banerjee did not soften the answer. Then you've already done the most important thing you were ever going to do today, and getting out afterward becomes a secondary objective rather than the mission itself. I won't lie to you about that, but I will tell you that every simulation we've run in the last 6 hours suggests that fleet coherence collapse, if it happens fast enough that you'll have a window to disengage before coordinated pursuit becomes possible. It's not a guarantee. Nothing here is a guarantee, but it's the best plan anyone in this building could build in 17 hours against an enemy fleet 40 times our size. The strike force launched 4 hours before the main Threll Compact fleet was projected to enter effective range of Earth's orbital defenses, a timing calculated to maximize the element of surprise while still allowing enough margin for the strike to be completed, and the strike force to attempt withdrawal before the broader fleet could respond to whatever happened at its center. What the Threll Compact command structure, to the extent that anything resembling individual personality or decision-making authority could be reconstructed afterward from intercepted communications and the testimony of survivors, had not anticipated, was that a target species with a fleet 40 times smaller than their own would attempt anything other than either immediate surrender or a desperate, doomed conventional engagement against the bulk of the formation. Their own doctrine, refined across numerous previous campaigns against less prepared civilizations, simply did not account for an opponent who would correctly identify and target the fleet's actual command architecture, rather than wasting their limited resources on a symbolic but tactically meaningless confrontation with the visible mass of the formation. High Coordinator Vethric Salane, commanding the Threll Compact fleet from one of the 7 vessels Doyle's team had identified as a coordination node, registered Earth's interceptor squadron's approach with what subsequent analysis of recovered command logs suggested was genuine confusion rather than alarm. 60 ships, against a formation of over 10,000, did not register on Threll tactical doctrine as a credible threat worth significant defensive reallocation. Minor harassment vessels, Salane's tactical officer reported, according to the partial logs later recovered. Insufficient numbers to threaten formation integrity. Recommend continued advance without course correction. This assessment, reasonable by every standard the Threll Compact's own military culture had ever validated, turned out to be the single most consequential miscalculation of the entire engagement. 60 ships were, by any conventional measure, an insignificant threat to a fleet of 10,000. But 60 ships specifically targeting 7 irreplaceable coordination nodes, executing a strike plan built around exploiting exactly the structural vulnerability that the Threll Compact had never previously encountered an opponent capable of identifying, represented something the Threll tactical doctrine had no framework for evaluating at all. Captain Lindqvist's squadron reached the first of the 7 targeted vessels 11 minutes after launch, having threaded their approach through gaps in the formation's outer perimeter that Doyle's analysis had identified as the least heavily defended vectors precisely, because the Threll Compact had never expected any opponent to attempt a strike against their formation's interior at all. "Target acquired," Lindqvist reported, her voice tight with the particular concentration of someone executing a maneuver she had rehearsed exactly twice in simulation before being asked to perform it for real against an enemy fleet 40 times her own force's size. Engaging coordination vessel designated Tango 1. The engagement against the 7 coordination nodes, when it came, was not a prolonged battle in any conventional sense. Each of Earth's 60 interceptors had been assigned a specific role within a tightly choreographed strike sequence, designed to achieve maximum simultaneous damage against all 7 targets within the narrowest possible window, minimizing the chance that any single coordination vessel's destruction would trigger a fleet-wide alert before the remaining nodes could also be eliminated. Within 4 minutes of first contact, 5 of the 7 identified coordination vessels had sustained critical damage sufficient to disable their command function, if not destroy them outright. The remaining 2, having registered the attack pattern and attempted evasive maneuvers, took an additional 90 seconds to disable, a delay that Banerjee later acknowledged in debriefing had been the single most dangerous moment of the entire engagement, since it represented 90 seconds during which the broader Threll fleet had at least partial warning that something unprecedented was happening at its command core. "All 7 nodes confirmed disabled," Lindqvist reported, 6 minutes and 40 seconds after the strike force's first shot. "Admiral, I don't know what happens next, but it's happening right now." What happened next, in the minutes and hours that followed, became one of the most extensively studied tactical case studies across multiple civilizations in the decades afterward, precisely because it demonstrated, with almost laboratory precision, exactly how dependent even an overwhelmingly numerically superior force could be on centralized coordination. Without the 7 disabled command vessels providing unified tactical direction, the remaining 10,000-plus ships of the Threll Compact fleet did not collapse into chaos instantly, but began, over the following 90 minutes, a slow and increasingly visible breakdown in coordinated maneuver. Formation spacing, which had remained tight and uniform throughout the fleet's approach, began drifting as individual ship commanders, accustomed to receiving constant tactical instruction, found themselves suddenly without guidance and uncertain how to proceed. "They're not advancing anymore," reported Colonel Whitfield, watching the tactical display from the command facility as the formation's forward momentum visibly stalled. "General, the lead elements have stopped. They're not retreating, but they're not advancing either. I think they genuinely don't know what to do." This assessment, while accurate in its broad strokes, understated the depth of the confusion that had actually taken hold within the Threll Compact fleet. Individual ship commanders, interviewed years later after diplomatic relations between Earth and the surviving remnants of the Threll Compact had been cautiously established, described the experience of those 90 minutes in terms that human military psychologists found genuinely fascinating from an organizational behavior perspective. "We had never operated independently," one surviving Threll commander explained, through a translator during a later academic exchange program. "Our entire training, our entire military culture, assumed centralized coordination as a permanent, unquestionable feature of how warfare functioned. When the coordination vessels went silent, it was not simply that we lost instructions. It was that an entire category of decision-making that had never been asked of us suddenly became necessary, and most of us had no framework for providing it. Some commanders simply held position, waiting for instructions that would never come. Others attempted independent action, but without any coordination with neighboring vessels, often working at cross purposes with ships that should have been allies in the same engagement. This breakdown, rather than immediately ending the threat to Earth, instead transformed it into something more manageable, if still genuinely dangerous. Not a single coordinated fleet of 10,000 ships advancing with unified purpose, but a sprawling, disorganized collection of individual vessels and small, uncoordinated clusters, many of which began making increasingly erratic tactical decisions as their commanders attempted, without success, to re-establish some form of effective coordination among themselves. Admiral Banerjee, monitoring this breakdown from her flagship, recognized the window this created and moved to exploit it before the Threll Compact could potentially establish alternative command structures from among its surviving vessels. "All remaining defense assets. This is Banerjee. The enemy formation has lost central coordination. I want every available ship engaging isolated clusters, prioritizing targets that show any sign of attempting to re-establish coordinated command. We are not trying to destroy 10,000 ships today either. We are trying to prevent this fleet from ever becoming coordinated again." The engagements that followed, scattered across nearly 6 hours, and spanning a volume of space considerably larger than any single battle in recorded human military history, bore little resemblance to the clean, decisive strike that had disabled the original 7 coordination nodes. Individual interceptor squadrons found themselves engaging isolated groups of 3, 5, sometimes a dozen Threll vessels at a time, fights that were genuinely dangerous and resulted in real losses on humanity's side. Losses that General Castellan would later describe, in his own debriefing, as the part of the engagement that the popular retelling of the battle almost always glossed over in favor of the cleaner, more satisfying narrative of the initial coordination strike. "People remember the 7 ships," he said. "They don't remember that we lost 11 of our own vessels and 43 pilots in the 6 hours of cleanup engagement that followed, fighting against an enemy that, even disorganized, was still individually more heavily armed and armored than anything we had. The coordination strike won us an opportunity. It did not win us the battle. The battle was won in the messy 6 hours afterward, by pilots who had to fight without the clean, tactical clarity of the original plan, improvising against an enemy that was confused but still very capable of killing them. By the time the engagement's final phase concluded, with the last meaningfully organized Threll resistance either destroyed or in full retreat toward the jump corridor through which the fleet had originally arrived, the numbers told a story that defied almost every prediction anyone had made in the 17 hours of preparation before the battle began. Of the original 10,412 Threll Compact vessels, approximately 1,200 had been destroyed outright. A further several thousand had sustained damage sufficient to force their withdrawal from the engagement, and the remainder had retreated in a disorganized scattering that bore no resemblance to the disciplined formation that had entered the system less than a day earlier. Earth's losses, while genuinely painful and the subject of considerable mourning across the weeks that followed, totaled 11 destroyed vessels and 43 confirmed pilot deaths, a casualty ratio against an enemy force 40 times Earth's original fleet size that several visiting military observers from other species, once diplomatic contact eventually expanded, described in terms that several human officers found uncomfortably close to disbelief. "They keep asking me how we achieved a ratio like that," Admiral Banerjee said in an interview conducted roughly 2 years after the engagement. "And I keep telling them the same thing because it's the only honest answer I have. We didn't achieve a favorable ratio by being individually better fighters or by having better ships, though our ships were good. We achieved it because we understood something about how large fleets actually function that the Threll Compact's own doctrine had never forced them to examine. 10,000 ships sounds unbeatable until you realize that 10,000 ships without coordination is just 10,000 individually vulnerable targets waiting for someone to point out that the Emperor has no clothes." High Coordinator Vethric Salin, one of the 7 officers commanding the original coordination vessels, survived the initial strike against his ship, though severely injured, and was eventually recovered along with several other Threll prisoners in the engagement's aftermath. In a series of debriefings conducted over the following months, translated and partially declassified years later for academic study, Salin offered a perspective on the engagement that several human strategists found more illuminating than almost anything in their own after-action reports. "You did not defeat my fleet," Salin said, according to the translated transcript. "You defeated my fleet's assumption that it would never need to function without me. That is a different kind of defeat, and I think it is the kind that should worry us more, because it suggests that any force built around centralized control, however large, carries a vulnerability that has nothing to do with the size of the opponent it eventually faces. You did not need 10,000 ships of your own. You needed to understand that mine were not actually 10,000 independent decisions. They were one decision, repeated 10,000 times, and you only needed to stop the original decision from being made." This insight, articulated by the very commander whose fleet had suffered the consequences of it, became something of a foundational text in military academies across multiple species in the years that followed, studied alongside the original Severance Doctrine paper that Colonel Whitfield had spent 15 years defending against skeptics, before finally seeing it validated under the most extreme possible test conditions. Whitfield herself, in the years following the engagement, became something of a reluctant celebrity within military circles, an attention she handled with visible discomfort in nearly every public appearance she made. "I didn't predict this specific battle," she said, in one frequently cited interview given roughly 5 years after the engagement. "I predicted a category of vulnerability that I believed any sufficiently centralized military structure would eventually exhibit under the right conditions. I got lucky that the conditions arrived in a form clear enough that the theory could actually be tested and confirmed rather than just argued about in academic papers forever. Most theories don't get that kind of clean validation. I'm not sure I'd call what happened a triumph of foresight so much as a fortunate alignment between a theoretical framework and a real-world enemy who happened to be vulnerable in exactly the way the framework predicted. Felix Doyle, whose analytical work had identified the 7 critical coordination vessels under brutal time pressure with imperfect information, found his own relationship to the engagement's legacy considerably more complicated than the clean narrative suggested by most retellings. In a later interview, he described the 11 hours of analysis that had identified the coordination nodes not as a moment of brilliant insight, but as a process riddled with uncertainty that had simply, by considerable fortune, turned out to be correct. "I want to be honest about something," he said. "We were not certain. We were never certain. Every model I built had error bars wide enough that if you'd asked me to bet my own life on those 7 ships being the right targets, I would have hesitated. I told General Castellan I was confident because confidence was what the situation required, but privately what I actually fee." LT was something closer to calculated desperation. We had 17 hours and an impossible problem, and I built the best answer I could in the time available, and it happened to be right. I think people deserve to know that the difference between the celebrated version of this story and a much darker alternate history, where I picked the wrong 7 ships and we lost everything, was thinner than anyone likes to admit. This candor, repeated in various forms across nearly every first-hand account eventually collected from the engagement's key participants, became, in its own way, as significant a part of the battle's legacy as the tactical lessons themselves. General Castellan, reflecting on the engagement during a lecture delivered to senior officers several years afterward, attempted to articulate why this honesty mattered as much as the victory itself. "We won," he told the assembled officers, "and I am deeply grateful that we won because the alternative was the end of everything we know. But I want every person in this room to resist the temptation to look back at that day and see inevitability where there was actually enormous, genuine uncertainty. We did not know the 7 ships were the right targets. We hoped, based on the best available analysis, that they were. We did not know the coordination strike would create the kind of breakdown Whitfield's theory predicted. We hoped it would, based on 15 years of theoretical work that had never been tested under real conditions. Hope backed by rigorous preparation and the willingness to act decisively under uncertainty is not the same thing as certainty, and conflating the two is how future commanders convince themselves that the next impossible problem will solve itself the same way this one did, simply because it worked once. The diplomatic aftermath of the engagement unfolded slowly over the following years, complicated considerably by the fractured, leaderless state in which the surviving remnants of the Threll Compact found themselves after the loss of their coordination vessels and the subsequent collapse of unified command. Without the centralized structure that had defined their military culture for generations, the Threll Compact's surviving political and military leadership underwent what several analysts described as a genuine identity crisis. Struggling to reconstitute any form of unified governance in the absence of the rigid hierarchical structures their entire civilization had been built around. Salane, eventually released from custody as part of an early diplomatic exchange and permitted to return to Threll space, became an unlikely figure in his own civilization's gradual reckoning with what had happened, publishing extensively on the structural vulnerabilities his own species had never previously been forced to examine. His writings, controversial within more traditional Threll political circles, but increasingly influential among a younger generation of officers, eager to understand exactly how their seemingly unstoppable fleet had been defeated by a force 40 times smaller, eventually contributed to significant reforms in Threll military doctrine that emphasized distributed decision-making authority in ways that would have been unthinkable before the engagement. On Earth, the battle that came to be known with a degree of dark humor that several survivors found entirely appropriate. As the 7-ship problem reshaped defense planning in ways that extended well beyond the specific tactical lessons of exploiting centralized command vulnerabilities. The engagement's narrow margin of success, achieved through 17 hours of frantic preparation against an enemy that outnumbered Earth's entire defense capability by a factor of more than 40 to 1, prompted a fundamental reassessment of how quickly humanity could realistically expect to identify and exploit critical vulnerabilities in future, potentially even larger threats. General Castellan, addressing this concern directly in testimony before a joint legislative committee reviewing defense appropriations roughly a year after the engagement, offered an assessment that several committee members found considerably less reassuring than they had hoped to hear. "I am not here to tell you that we have solved the problem of facing overwhelming numerical superiority," he said. "I am here to tell you that we got remarkably fortunate that this particular enemy happened to be vulnerable in a way our existing theoretical work had already anticipated, and that we had, by considerable luck, exactly the right analyst available to identify that vulnerability under brutal time pressure. The next enemy fleet that arrives at our doorstep may not share this particular structural weakness. It may have redundant command authority distributed in ways that make a strike like the one we executed completely ineffective. We did not win this battle because we have a reliable solution to facing overwhelming numbers. We won because we had spent decades doing theoretical work broad enough that, when an actual crisis arrived, we had at least one applicable framework available, and we had the discipline to verify and apply it correctly under pressure. The lesson is not that this specific tactic will always work. The lesson is that broad, patient theoretical preparation, even when it seems abstract and unlikely to ever matter, is the only thing that gives you any chance at all when the actual crisis turns out to look nothing like what you specifically planned for. This testimony, while less triumphant than many had expected from an officer who had just overseen one of the most significant defensive victories in human history, became, in its own quiet way, as influential as the battle itself in shaping subsequent defense policy. Funding for theoretical military research, previously a perpetually underappreciated and chronically underfunded category of defense spending, saw significant and sustained increases in the years following the engagement, driven by a hard-won institutional recognition that the difference between survival and annihilation had, in this case, come down to a 15-year-old academic paper that almost nobody outside a narrow specialist community had taken seriously until the morning it suddenly needed to save the planet. Colonel Whitfield, in her own final public address before retiring from active military research roughly a decade after the engagement, offered what many considered the most fitting summary of the battle's true legacy, delivered to a graduating class of strategic theorists who had chosen their field specifically because of the engagement that had defined her own career. "You are going to spend your careers building theories that most people will consider unnecessary, abstract, and probably wrong," she told them. "Most of those theories, statistically speaking, will never be tested, will never matter, and will quietly gather dust exactly the way mine did for 15 years. I want you to do the work anyway. Not because you'll be vindicated, most of you won't be, and that's simply the nature of this work, but because somewhere in the vast collection of theories that this profession produces, one of them is going to turn out to be the only thing standing between your civilization and an enemy fleet of 10,000 ships that arrives one morning with no warning at all. You won't know which theory it is until it's needed. Nobody ever does. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the work. It is the entire reason the work has to be done so broadly, so patiently, and so far in advance of ever knowing if it will matter." Captain Sarah Lindqvist, who had led the original strike squadron against the 7 coordination vessels, carried a different relationship to the engagement's legacy than either Castellan or Whitfield, one rooted less in doctrine and theory than in the simple, persistent memory of those 6 minutes and 40 seconds, when 60 pilots had thrown themselves at an enemy formation, 40 times their own number based on nothing more than a single analyst's 11-hour assessment. In the years following the battle, she gave few interviews, and in the handful she did give, returned repeatedly to a detail that almost never made it into the official histories. "Everyone wants to talk about the 7 ships," she said, in one of her rare extended conversations with a military historian compiling an oral archive of the engagement nearly a decade later. Nobody asks about the moment before we launched, when Admiral Banerjee told us this might be a one-way trip and asked if anyone wanted to step back. Nobody did. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than the tactics. It wasn't bravery, not the kind people imagine. It was that every single one of us had spent our entire careers training for a moment we genuinely believed would probably never come. And when it actually arrived, stepping back felt less like self-preservation and more like abandoning the only thing all that training had ever been for. I don't know if that makes sense to someone who hasn't lived it. But in that moment, flying away felt like a stranger, scarier option than flying toward 10,000 ships. This sentiment, that the true psychological core of the engagement lay not in the elegant tactical solution, but in the simple, unglamorous willingness of 60 individual pilots to commit to a plan that offered no guarantee of survival, became a recurring theme in how the battle was eventually taught to subsequent generations of officers, deliberately balanced against the more triumphant narrative of clever strategic insight that had originally dominated public discussion of the engagement. Rear Admiral Banerjee, reflecting on her own role in authorizing the strike with such limited certainty about its outcome, offered a perspective in her later memoir that several reviewers found notably more vulnerable than the confident command voice she had projected during the engagement itself. "I told my pilots I believed in the plan," she wrote. "What I did not tell them, because there was no time and it would have served no purpose, was that I spent the 4 hours between authorizing the strike and receiving Lindqvist's first contact report, convinced I had just sent 60 people to die for a theory that might turn out to be wrong in ways none of us could have anticipated. Command does not mean certainty. It means making the best decision available with the information you have, and then carrying the weight of that decision alone, in silence, while the people who trusted your judgment go and risk everything to execute it. I have made peace with that decision because it turned out to be correct. I think about, more often than I would like to admit, the version of this story where it wasn't. The broader diplomatic and scientific consequences of the engagement extended well beyond the specific tactical and doctrinal lessons that dominated most military analysis. The sheer scale of the Threll Compact fleet, even disorganized and ultimately defeated, represented an industrial and logistical capability that prompted considerable concern among Earth's scientific community regarding what other, similarly large-scale threats might exist among neighboring civilizations that humanity had not yet encountered. Dr. Amara Voss, an astrophysicist who had spent her career studying long-range signals from distant star systems with comparatively little institutional support, found her own research suddenly and dramatically elevated in priority in the engagement's aftermath. "For 15 years, I struggled to get funding for basic long-range detection research," she said, in testimony before the same legislative committee that had questioned General Castellan about the reliability of future defense strategies. "The argument against funding it was always the same. What's the actual threat we're preparing for? And how do we justify the expense without a concrete enemy to point to?" The Threll Compact fleet answered that question more thoroughly than 15 years of my own advocacy ever managed to. There are civilizations out there capable of fielding fleets of 10,000 ships. We had no idea this one existed until they were already in our outer system. The next one might not give us even the partial warning we received this time. This concern that humanity's survival in this particular engagement had depended on a combination of fortunate timing, a single insomniac director's early detection, and a structural vulnerability in the attacking force that might not exist in future threats, drove significant expansion of Earth's deep space detection capabilities in the years that followed, an expansion that, much like the original defense systems that had proven decisive in earlier engagements, was built largely by people who fully expected their work might never be tested again in their lifetimes. Felix Doyle, whose analytical work had identified the 7 coordination vessels under such punishing time pressure, eventually moved away from active sensor analysis work entirely, taking a position training the next generation of analysts in the specific discipline of rapid pattern identification under incomplete information, a field that, prior to the engagement, had existed only as a minor subspecialty within the broader intelligence community. I used to think my job was finding the right answer, he told one of his first classes of trainees, in a lecture later transcribed and distributed throughout multiple intelligence training programs. I don't think that anymore. My job, the day this all happened, was finding the best available answer in the time I had, accepting that it might be wrong, and being honest with my commanding officer about exactly how uncertain that answer actually was. The myth of the brilliant analyst who simply sees the truth others miss is mostly fiction. What actually happened in that room was hours of grinding, uncertain work, performed by people who were frightened and exhausted, and aware the entire time that they might be about to send 60 pilots to die based on a mistake. I want every one of you to understand that this is what the job actually feels like. Because if you go into this field expecting the clean, confident certainty you see in dramatized retellings, the first time you face something like what I faced, you will freeze, and freezing is the one thing this job cannot afford. High Coordinator Salin's own post-engagement trajectory took an unexpected turn several years after his initial release and return to Threll space, when he was invited, in a diplomatic gesture that several officials on both sides considered remarkably bold given the circumstances, to participate in a joint academic symposium hosted partly on Earth and partly through remote connection, examining engagement from both the human and Threll perspectives simultaneously. His appearance, broadcast to audiences across both civilizations, included a direct, unscripted exchange with Colonel Whitfield that several attendees later described as one of the more remarkable moments in the early history of human-Threll diplomatic relations. I have read your original paper, Salin told her through translation, in front of an audience of several hundred officers and academics from both species. 15 years before you ever saw my fleet, you had already described in theoretical terms exactly how to defeat it. I find this almost more unsettling than the battle itself. It suggests that the vulnerability was not something specific to my command structure, born of some particular failure on my part, but something inherent to any sufficiently centralized military doctrine, waiting to be discovered by anyone patient enough to look for it theoretically before ever needing to exploit it practically. That's precisely what unsettles me too, Whitfield responded, because it means somewhere out there is a vulnerability in our doctrine that some other analyst on some other world has already described in a paper nobody important has bothered to read yet. I don't find any comfort in having been right about your fleet. I find it as a reminder that whatever confidence we currently hold in our own systems is probably resting on assumptions just as untested as yours were, right up until the morning they weren't. This exchange, widely circulated afterward across both human and Threll academic circles, became something of a touchstone for a broader, more cautious approach to military doctrine that gradually took hold across multiple civilizations in the years following the engagement. A growing recognition that any system built around centralized control, regardless of how successful or dominant it appeared, carried inherent structural vulnerabilities that might remain invisible until precisely the wrong moment revealed them, and that the only meaningful defense against such vulnerabilities was the kind of patient, often unrewarded theoretical work that Whitfield had pursued for 15 years before anyone outside a narrow specialist community had taken it seriously at all. General Castellan, in the final years before his own retirement, was occasionally asked by younger officers whether he considered the engagement against the Threll Compact fleet humanity's greatest military achievement. His answer, recorded in one of his last extended interviews before stepping down from active command, remained consistent with the cautious, uncertainty-acknowledging tone he had maintained throughout every public discussion of the battle since its earliest aftermath. I consider it the day we got the most important question right, under the worst possible circumstances, with the least possible time to be sure we were right, he said. I do not consider it proof that we have solved the problem of facing overwhelming force. I consider it proof that decades of patient, often mocked theoretical preparation gave us exactly one usable answer when an impossible problem arrived without warning, and that having one usable answer, even an uncertain one, was the entire difference between everything we know continuing to exist and everything we know ending in a single afternoon. I hope, sincerely, that the next generation never needs to test whether they have an equivalent answer ready for whatever comes next. But I know with complete certainty that hoping is not a strategy, and that somewhere right now, someone underfunded and unglamorous is doing the theoretical work that might someday be the only thing standing between all of us and a fleet considerably larger than 10,000 ships. He paused in that same interview, before adding one final remark that the historian conducting the conversation later said had stayed with him longer than almost anything else Castellan said that day. People ask me what it felt like, watching 10,412 ships appear on a sensor display with 17 hours to respond, he said. I tell them it felt like falling, the kind where your body understands what's happening before your mind has caught up enough to be afraid yet. And then, somewhere in those 17 hours, the falling stopped being the only sensation, because there was work to do, and the work gave everyone in that room something to hold on to besides the fear. I think that's true of every crisis like this, however large or small. The fear doesn't go away. It just stops being the loudest thing in the room once enough people decide there's something useful left to do with the time they have. Years later, when the engagement had settled fully into the textbooks, and the academies, and the cautious, ongoing dialogue between human and Threll strategists who continued studying it from opposite sides of the same impossible M. Orning what remained consistent across every account, every memoir, every reluctant interview given by the people who had lived through those 17 hours, was the same quiet refusal to claim more certainty than the moment had actually contained. 10,000 ships had come. One plan, built from 15 years of unrewarded theory and 17 hours of frightened, careful analysis, had been all humanity ever had to answer them with. It had been enough, that single time, against that single enemy, in those specific circumstances. Nobody who had actually been there ever allowed themselves to forget how easily it might not have been, and that refusal to forget, more than any monument or anniversary or formal commemoration ever could, became the truest and most lasting tribute the engagement ever received.